Good morning, everyone. We're going to wait just a few seconds for everyone to get on, and then we'll get started. Good morning, everybody. We're glad to have you with us this morning. Welcome to the Salt Lake Chamber's webinar, Utah's Changing Demographics, with Mallory Bateman. If you have not had the opportunity to listen to Mallory Bateman, you are in for a treat. Mallory is a senior research analyst and at the Kem C Gardner Policy Institute. And she's going to be speaking today on the census and how Utah's demographics are changing, as we all know. This webinar is being recorded, and we will send out the link of the recording afterwards, and we'll send out any other materials that Mallory talks about. So welcome, Mallory. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me, and I'm going to share my screen, so bear with me for just a second. We'll get the show on the road. So, as Maria mentioned, I'm Mallory Bateman. I'm over at the Kem C Gardner Policy Institute, which is part of the David Eccles School of Business at the U. I'm a senior research analyst and also the State Data Center Coordinator. So that's a partnership program with the Census Bureau, all 50 states. I'm kind of your boots on the ground census helper with programs and products. So if you ever have any questions about what's going on over at the Census Bureau, then feel free to reach out and let me know. I'll make sure to share my contact information at the end. But over at the Gardner Institute, we have kind of three main sectors. We look at economics and public policy, demographics, which is what I'm focused on, what we'll talk about today, and then survey research. So if you haven't visited our website, go to gardner.utah.edu and you can look at, we have a lot going on lately, so a lot of new and exciting research coming out. So I want to give you kind of a preview of what we're going to go through today, just so that you're not surprised or disappointed if we don't cover what you were hoping for. But, you know, the big overarching theme is that growing and changing population is a longstanding constant in Utah. So keep that in mind. We're going to focus on basic demographics, and we're not really going to dive into socioeconomic characteristics, and I'll explain why in just a minute. Urban areas in Utah, as well as nationally, grew this decade, while smaller communities had more diverse experiences with growth or decline. And then Utahns as a whole are becoming more racially and ethnically diverse. So I'm going to give a high-level overview of the census just to remind everybody, so we're all starting from the same page. But the census is a once-a-decade count of everybody living in the United States. It's actually constitutionally mandated. It's a huge effort. It was initially established to be, you know, for apportionment, which we use it for, obviously, but then also was supposed to, in the founding documents, they were hoping it would also facilitate direct taxes, some kind of per capita thing. Didn't end up working out, so we're just using it for apportionment. As I mentioned, it's a huge effort. So we have, you know, 330 million people in the US, and it's the largest peacetime government mobilization. So those red spikes on here are federal employees. This whole chart is federal employees, but those red spikes are the decennial. You can see that the end spike is a little shorter. 2020 obviously threw everyone for a loop, and that impacted the hiring, but still you can see that significant impact. And then the three main reasons why it's important for this once a decade count, which sometimes can feel a little archaic. 10 years is a long time, but we need it for planning. It sets the baseline for looking forward into the future. Over at Gardner, we do population projections, looking out long term. We're actually working on those now that we have the new numbers. We're really excited to get those out in the fall. And then those numbers and other numbers get used, you know, by a myriad groups throughout the state. We've always grown, so we have a good practice of planning for growth. but we need these numbers to facilitate that. It's also hugely important for funding, both for allocation of federal funds, but also state funds, you know, planning businesses, planning marketing. Money, money is huge, even though this seems like a pretty bureaucratic short form that might not provide a ton of insight. It's hugely important. And then obviously the one that does get a lot of attention is the political power. This is showing our 4 existing congressional seats and then some of our state house districts. You know, we'll get into some of the areas that grew, but there's definitely going to be some changes, I would imagine, with some of the growth that's occurred throughout the decade. So just to kind of provide some insight into what we have and what we don't have, from the 2020 census so far, we've received the apportionment number, so getting those congressional seats allocated. And then we also recently got the redistricting data. And so the redistricting data provides more insight than we had with the apportionment data, but it provides, now we have total populations for states, counties, cities, and then other smaller statistical geographies. There's also other geographies like tribal entities, and then some different kinds of city breakdowns they use in the Northeast that are included in this, but the most relevant to us are these. We also get detailed race and ethnicity. Ethnicity in the Census Bureau language means Hispanic or Latino origin. And then there's 5 main race groups. We'll get into that more toward the end. We have insights into 2 age groups. You get the total population and then the population of voting age. So we can decipher over and under 18. And then we also have some information, some basic information on housing units, whether they're occupied or vacant. So it's exciting to get all this data, but I just want you to know there's only so much we can share at this point. What we don't have so far that's yet to be received from the 2020 data are the rest of the details of the questionnaire. So things like the relationship in households, the tenure, if a unit is owned or rented, ancestry, which was added in this time for the first time, sex, so male or female, and then that full age detail. And I don't know if you have a vivid memory of filling out your form like I do, but it was a short questionnaire. It's pretty limited in what it asked for. And so that's what we're waiting for. Hopefully they'll give us an update on when that's going to be released. We're expecting sometime next year. So stay tuned for that additional detail. We'll dig into it as soon as it comes out. What isn't included in the decennial census actually gets covered by another survey called the American Community Survey. And that includes all the characteristics, things people are really, really excited to get. Things like educational attainment, household income, employment, veteran status, disability status, things like that. We're not going to dive into those characteristics today because even though we have a limited data set, there's a lot to pull out of it with that redistricting data. But do know that that's a resource that exists if you ever need to look into these characteristics of the population. So regionally, the Intermountain region has had kind of an interesting growth trajectory. This is looking back to 1900. So 1900 to 1960 is the year that's kind of cut in half. But you can see all of the states in our region kind of following a similar growth pattern. You know, there were similar economies in these states. There was a lot of extraction industry. There was a lot of agriculture. A lot of these states were kind of dominated by a handful of industries. And so there wasn't a lot of movement going on. You were seeing some growth, but it was pretty stable, slow and steady kind of growth. After 1960, you can see some divergence in how all of the states in the region grew. And you can see states like Arizona and Colorado just going nuts. You can see us where the bright red line, New Mexico is the darker red line, Nevada is the light blue line, all of us kind of hitting a higher stride around the 90s. And then you can see states like Montana and Wyoming, the 2 at the bottom, the light blue and the darker gray, that have kind of just stayed on that Western trajectory. Obviously, if you've been in Utah for a little bit, you can see the changing industries, the diversification of our economy. We've had a strong economy. We've had low unemployment. It brought a lot of people here, especially in the 90s. That migration wave in the 90s made a big impact on who we are and what we look like now. And that was seen in other states as well. You can see those upticks in Colorado and Arizona and Nevada during that same time period. Idaho too. Sorry, Idaho, I didn't give you a shout out, but Idaho, everyone kind of was impacted by that wave of migration, and those impacts are still being felt today. So this is kind of a fun nerd thing, and we don't have it for 2020 yet, but so this is if you made a map of the US and every person was a point, and this is where it would balance, is this mean center of population. And you can see that obviously at the beginning in 1790, you're way out on the East Coast, you're in between the colonies that exist. And then you start moving west and south, and looking at the growth, we'll see the map of the 2020 changes soon, but that growth is probably going to continue going in the south and west direction. The Intermountain region throughout this decade kept popping up. We had Nevada, we had Idaho, we had us popping as, you know, the fastest year-over-year growth. And so that makes a difference on where this mean center of population ends up. So within Utah, this is showing that red line again, but just all alone. We love to highlight ourselves. So the red line is population and the gray line are households, just so you have a little bit of context. The stars are when we hit millions. So that first star, we hit 1 million around 1966. We hit 2 million around 1995, and then we hit 3 million around 2015. And so now we got our number, you know, it was so exciting to see our 3,271,616 population in the 2020 census. And you can also see kind of the impact of that 90s migration with the changing trajectory of the line. So with the apportionment number, it was really exciting to get. Obviously, if you've been paying attention to this very hot topic, Utah didn't gain a seat. That wasn't a surprise. There weren't really any projections throughout the decade making it look like Utah was going to gain a seat. The states in yellow, outlined in yellow here, did gain a seat. So Montana was really excited to gain a second seat. Texas gained 2 seats, and they were the only state to do so. And then the blue, everyone else gained 1. The blue outlines are the states that lost seats. And so apportionment is kind of that balance of places that grow, places that don't grow, and evening out the population that way. All that being said, we were still the fastest growing state throughout the decade. So we grew 18.4%. We were kind of, as I mentioned, you can see Idaho and Nevada are also pretty high, and we were kind of neck and neck with Texas through the decadal growth. So we kind of beat Texas. Texas added like 3 million people. We added like 500,000. So there's some different scales to that growth, but we got that 18.4%. So it's pretty exciting to see. And our center of population, our mean center of population, has also been following that southwestern trajectory. We'll talk about this in just a second. But as you can see, this is only going to 2010, but it's also in an area that demands a lot of attention. There's a lot of development even in this area highlighted on the map, and that's not even considering our southwestern corner that had some significant growth throughout the decade as well. So sorry about the gray, it's not very exciting to look at, but this is showing the final number, so the 2020 census results for all of the counties. Salt Lake County is still our largest county, almost, well, 1.185 million. Utah County grew the second most, so overall growth, Salt Lake County grew the most, around 155,000. Utah County added 143,000 to end up at 659,000. And then the rest of the Wasatch Front, so Davis and Weber, and then Cache and Washington experienced the most growth in total numbers. Go back to this for 1 second. So I'll also throw out, if you're kind of new to Utah, if you're unfamiliar, 75% of our population lives along the Wasatch Front. So in those 4 counties of Weber, Davis, Salt Lake, and Utah. And then Cache County and Washington County add another 10%. So out of our 29 counties, 85% of our population lives in 6 counties. So that's just something interesting to consider. You know, our ring areas, counties like Tooele, Summit, Wasatch, that neighbor the Wasatch Front had really high rates of growth. But as you can see, the overall total population is still relatively low. So this is kind of what I was talking about with that mean center of population map. here are our cities, to kind of narrow it down, that grew the fastest in the decade. And so the blue is the 2010 population, the red outline is the 2020 population. And so you can see these massive gaps for some of these communities where you've added so many people. Vineyard was the fun, exciting one because it grew by almost 9,000%, growing from 150-ish, 59 people in 2010 to over 12,000. South Jordan actually made it in the national press conference for being one of the communities that grew the fastest, that started with 50,000 people, at least 50,000 people in 2010. And it followed the trend that was seen in the other cities that shared this categorization, the fast growing cities over 50,000. They were all nearby, existing urban centers. So South Jordan in census language, super close to Salt Lake City. There was one up next to Boise. I apologize, I don't remember which city it was, but somewhere like Meridian or something. And then Texas, cities near Austin and Houston had, explosive growth when people were trying to get to the area throughout the decade. Similar things, strong economies, bringing people in. So now we're going to talk about what drives that growth. There's some preconceived notions about Utah and our growth that maybe are a little outdated. And so we'll dive into those. So on this figure, we have net migration. So that's people moving in minus people moving out. That's the gray area. So if it's above that 0 line, that means more people moved in than out. The red line is natural increase, which is births minus deaths. And that is typically what I feel like people outside of Utah think drives our growth. It did play a significant role. It was almost 2/3 of our growth throughout this decade. But you can see that gray chunk is not going away, with the exception of the Great Recession. Since the 90s, it's been above 0 and been adding to our population. And then that overall population change is marked with the black line. So without migration, our growth would look very different. This is work that was done by my boss, Pam Perlich, and my colleague, Mike Hollingshouse, a couple years ago, modeling what it would have looked like if we wouldn't have had that wave of migration in the 90s. And so you can see that gray area is what would have happened with 0 migration, which is pretty hard to imagine considering our current state. But without the migration, and then people staying here, having families here, maybe those kids staying and starting their own families, so kind of an iterative effect. Without all those people moving in, we would have hit 3 million in 2031. So it would have taken another 15, 16 years to hit 3 million people. The red area shows what happened, and then the estimated, at the time, this was using, I think, around our 2017 numbers, when we're going to hit 4 million. And you can see it's just a very different trajectory. And I know there are a lot of opinions on growth, whether it's good, whether it's bad, what it means for a state, if it's a success measure. But without that wave in the 90s, we would look like a very different state. We would probably look a little bit more like a Montana or a Wyoming that kept that kind of slow and steady growth trajectory. And it would make Utah look pretty different from where we are now. So this is kind of going back a little bit because that's how we have to look back for this data. But this is looking at young adults. So on the left side of my screen is the net migration of 15 to 24-year-olds. The gray areas are those that gained people, and then the red or pink areas are those that lost. And then on the right side is young adults, so 25 to 29-year-olds. Same color scheme, gray means people came in, red means people left. And you can see that in our smaller counties, our more kind of rural counties, younger people are leaving. At least they were last decade. And with the numbers we have now, it looks like that might continue to be one of the drivers. In a lot of these, well, in 7 of these counties, these smaller counties, they actually lost population between 2010 and 2020. And so, the dynamics in the state also impact what our population looks like and where we live. kind of going out of the aggregate, diving in a tiny bit more to look at where people live. And obviously, in our urban areas, we have more educational opportunities for young adults. We have more employment opportunities. There's more connections to other communities. It's easier to get to, get on a plane in Salt Lake or Provo or maybe Ogden or down in St. George than it is in other communities. So things that impact, again, what we look like and where we are. So the other component with that natural or the net migration is natural increase. And so despite the fact that we are, people know us for our big families, having lots of kids, that trend is kind of changing. We're still high. So in 2018, we actually fell to second place for total fertility rate. So total fertility rate is kind of the average number of children that a woman of childbearing age could expect to have in that year. But it kind of washes out the differences for different age groups and provides you with one number that's comparable over time. And so in the past couple of years, the Dakotas have actually jumped above us in total fertility rate. Part of that is due to all of us having declining teen fertility rates, which is great. But then also younger moms, so 20 to 24, their rates are dropping, their birth rates are dropping. And then in the Dakotas, moms over 30 are seeing increases to their rates. We haven't quite seen that bump up yet in that 30 plus group. And so that's why we're at number 3. But you can see us in red here, kind of following the national trajectory. We have a paper kind of digging into the first part of the impact of the recession and that decline in fertility rates compared to the US. So this is one thing, if we're having fewer babies, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to grow with natural increase alone. The other thing that we have kind of going counter to this is the population is aging. There have been a lot of articles for the past, 5 to 10 years about kind of the graying of America. We have the biggest cohort prior to the millennials, the baby boomers are starting to age. We're all, if we're lucky enough to age, we get older, but then that also kind of leads to one end point. And so when you have births minus deaths, if deaths are increasing and births are decreasing, that growth from natural increase is going to be a little bit trickier to come by. As you can see, this is median age in Utah in red and the US in gray. And we're still a lot younger than the nation. If you look up at the Northeast, some of those states are, 40 years old for their median age. So 31 is still young, prime of life. We're still the youngest state, but we're experiencing that aging of the population as well. And I threw this one in just because I was curious the other day and I looked at it. But again, considering the young people leaving some of our smaller and more rural areas, the median ages are different throughout the state. And so this is a tiny bit of a different source. It's the 5-year American Community Survey estimates. Because of our small communities, sometimes we have to turn to that. But you can see that Paiute and Daggett are actually some of our oldest, and they are kind of following that model of the Northeast with median ages in the 40s. Utah and Cache are the youngest, which I'm betting wouldn't be a surprise to most people. And then the closest to the state, that 31, are Uinta and Davis. So that was kind of interesting. One more. So all of these things combined, right? And then we get our growth. We get our growth or decline. And so here we have those changes between 2010 and 2020. And you can see those counties that did lose in the kind of pink, again, the red were pink, and then the darker gray indicating more intense growth. So you can see that 155,000 in Salt Lake County, 142,000 in Utah County. With all this growth and change, Wasatch Front is still 75% of the population. I ran the numbers and it's almost the same percentage to the 10th. So then we look at percentage growth. And as I mentioned, those neighboring counties to the urban areas had some pretty intense growth. Wasatch County was popping in the national rankings throughout the decade. The Census Bureau provides population estimates, made the top of the list there for intense growth. And so again, was the highest in the state at 47.9%. I looked into the cities and it's largely in Midway and Heber. It's not kind of an unincorporated county. So if you're driving around and it looks very different out there than it did last year, that's why. You also have that growth, that intense growth down in Washington and Iron counties. It's kind of funny when we have these scales of 47.9% growth. It's like, oh, 15% in Salt Lake County isn't that much. But then considering the rest of the nation as a whole grew by 7% in the decade, which was the lowest, second lowest after 1930 to 1940. So our state is experiencing kind of a wild ride. However, it's also decreased from previous decades. So if you look from 1990 to 2000, the growth rate was, I think, around 30 or in the high 20s. And then 2000 to 2010, you're at 25%. So our rate of growth is decreasing. And we didn't add quite as many people. The past 2 decades, we added over our 507,000 new Utahns. So when anyone is saying it's unprecedented growth, it's precedented. And it's also coming in an environment where we have been growing for a very long time. And this growth isn't wild and new. So just another thing to keep in mind when you're talking about our growth and the changes in the state. Now this, I was curious about this the other day, so I grabbed the counties that grew, and I wanted to see what was the driver in those areas. And so in the natural increase column, you can see some of them have over 100%, which means they actually had negative net migration, more people moving out, but it was compensated by having a positive natural increase. But you can see that natural increase was responsible for a lot of the growth in our state. Obviously at 2/3, it's going to make sense, but this is our breakdown of counties. Net migration counties I thought was interesting because there are kind of some similarities in these counties. You have counties where you might have a destination that draws people in. And this is residents. So it's not like people building vacation homes. These are residents. But you might have a destination. They all have some pretty significant natural beauty. Not that our other counties don't, but this net migration, there might be some similarities there. And then you can see Iron and Washington obviously popping. And then Wasatch, that growth, that 47.9% was largely driven by migration. So just something to consider. We have new people moving in. It's not all just Utahns, replicating on their own. We have new people moving in and they're kind of impacting what our population looks like. So now I'm going to dive into race and Hispanic or Latino origin, which is the other element that we got from the redistricting file. Sorry if this is a little blurry. I was trying to make it look really cool. But our racial and ethnic diversity in Utah has played a critical role in our population growth. So if you look at the 507,000 new Utahns, 52% are people that identify outside of non-Hispanic white, which I think is kind of what people assign to Utah. It is the most dominant population group, and we'll get into that in a minute, but our dynamics of race and ethnicity are changing. And then the blue pie is showing how the groups identified. So within the census language, we've got 5 major race groups. We have white, Black or African American, Asian, American Indian or Alaska Native, and then Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander. This time around, there was also some other race, and then people, all of this is self-identified, so you can identify as 2 or more races. So one thing that we noticed was that the some other race group kind of blew up, and that was seen in the national data. And part of that might actually be a technicality due to coding more inclusive more inclusive coding in how people's responses were recorded by the Census Bureau. We're hoping there's going to be more on that. I'm actually going to get to learn a little more later this afternoon. So sorry, the timing didn't quite line up so I could share any findings I got there. But it's a group that grew a lot. And we had been seeing that in the estimates, but this was a bit more than we had anticipated. 50% of our growth of the racial and ethnic minority population was Hispanic or Latino. That is our largest group outside of non-Hispanic white. And then the Asian population is 9%, but they actually grew quite a bit. If you look at percentage change, the Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander group actually grew by over 50%, I think. Their numbers are kind of low relative to, 150,000 Hispanic or Latino people, but we had some groups that grew that were kind of an interesting surprise this time around. So this time with the census, they used a term called the diversity index rather than minority majority, because in some states, minority majority just doesn't work anymore. The majority is, a combination of other groups. And so the language needs to be revisited. So diversity index is, if you pick someone at random, what are the odds that they're going to be of different racial and ethnic backgrounds? And in Utah, our number increased, and I don't have it in front of me, but we went up to, I think, 37%. And I'll double check that when we end to give you the right number. But despite our increase, other states seem to increase faster. Their diversification of racial and ethnic diversification kind of accelerated quicker than ours did. But you can see that in our counties, we have, again, different experiences. You can see San Juan County having the highest diversity index, and I'll show you that in a minute. And then Salt Lake, Utah, Weber, and Grand. So these are our most diverse counties, highest likelihood that people are going to come from different racial and ethnic backgrounds if you pick them at random. So this is the racial and ethnic composition in the state. And now 1 in 4 Utahns identify outside of non-Hispanic white, which is kind of cool, considering our growth and change throughout many decades. You can see that the Hispanic or Latino population is now up to 15.1%, and that 2 or more races in some other race group grew to 4%. So, we still have some smaller share-wise, pretty small populations, but they are growing. You can see there's a decline in the American Indian or Alaskan Native alone population. And so this is one thing we're going to investigate is, since you can choose more than one group, did people switch to American Indian, Alaskan Native, and another race group? Was that counted differently now than it was in 2010? There's prior research showing that the American Indian population is the most likely to be combined with another group. And so this number might be a teeny bit misleading. So we're actually working right now to investigate these different breakdowns and try to provide some additional insights that we'll hopefully have out soon. So this is the other part of the diversity index provided by the Census Bureau. They went with prevalence rankings. So these are the most prevalent racial and ethnic groups by county in Utah. The orange is the first, and that is white alone, not Hispanic or Latino, with the exception of San Juan County, where American Indian and Alaska Native alone, non-Hispanic or Latino, is the largest group. The middle is the second largest group. So you can see for most of the state, again, Hispanic or Latino is the largest, second largest group. And then San Juan is our exception to the rule, with white alone, non-Hispanic or Latino being the largest group. And then the third largest group is that kind of teal color. And you can see for most of the state, it's that 2 or more races. And one thing that we've found is that our younger populations are more likely to identify as 2 or more races. Again, this will be interesting when we get the full age detail and we can dig into this a bit more and see how that compares. So that's one consideration there. And then you can also see that in the kind of Uinta Basin, American Indian and Alaska Native alone is the third largest group. San Juan, it's Hispanic or Latino. And then Salt Lake is the one different one with Asian alone. And this group actually grew quite a bit in Salt Lake County. I can pull up the exact numbers after we kind of wrap this portion. But you can just see, I would recommend actually, if this is interesting to you, you don't have to, but go out to this racial prevalence group and look at the national maps. And it's super interesting to just see these different patterns in different parts of the nation. You know, where Black or African American alone is the largest group, where Hispanic or Latino is the largest group, things like that. Just provides a different level of context in a different way than I've seen it before. As I mentioned, younger Utahns are more likely to be racially and ethnically diverse than our older residents. And so this is from our really cool dashboard that our team put together to help Utahns dig into the data in a Utah specific way. With the, I don't know, greenish yellow color showing the under 18 share of population, and then the gray showing 18 and over. And you can see that even though the share of under 18 decreased, which was seen throughout the nation, I'll throw that out, we're not like, that's not odd. Everyone saw a decrease in that share. But you can see that there are still larger shares of those under 18 populations that identify as minority rather than non-Hispanic white. And so if that trend continues, if those younger people stay here, form their families here, you know, keep growth happening, attract other people here, work that we did a couple years ago indicates that this racial and ethnic diversification is going to continue in Utah. You can see on the left that, you know, kind of time series looking back to 1900, comparing the US in gray and Utah in red, the share of the minority population. And you can see that we're still below the nation, but we're following a similar trajectory. On the right, it breaks out by age. So youngest is at the axis, so under 5 going out to the oldest at the end on the right at 85 plus. And you can just see, again, those younger populations are more racially and ethnically diverse than our older populations, both in Utah and in the US. So I wanted to kind of start wrapping up with this. This was an article I saw in Utah Business a couple, I guess July, feels like a couple weeks ago. Apparently it was a couple months ago. But talking about the data, talking about things we've seen, and you know, we do get typecast as a certain type of place with certain attributes or characteristics. And while we do have some of those attributes and characteristics, I think things are changing, and we are seeing that in the data. We are seeing that racial and ethnic diversification, and it's, you know, like our population as a whole, that it's that growth and change that's kind of a constant driver in our state. It's something that helps us evolve, that helps us, you know, build those new industries and get into new slices of the economy. And so something that's going to continue as we move forward. And we'll see how it continues to play out. And then I'm gonna wrap. I'm getting a little early, so you might get a little bit of free time to go refill your Mountain Dew or your coffee or whatever. But you know, things change, but things stay the same. We still have the bones and the structure that helps this place develop. This is showing Main Street. You know, this is an intersection I'm familiar with, because if you get there, you're going north, you're going to be stuck at that light for a minute sometimes. So thinking about a Model T driving through isn't that hard to think about when you look at the buildings on the corner and up at Exchange Place that have been there for a very long time. But then you look a little farther up the street, you think about the things that have changed. We've got tracks, we've got, thank you, Downtown Alliance, open streets. We have things that are, you know, kind of highlighting the changing characteristics of our population. And so, you know, I think I think Utah is growing and changing as a place. And hopefully we can keep providing data insights to you all that are useful and help your businesses and organizations flourish. So I want to end with just my contact information. As I mentioned, if you do have questions, feel free to reach out to me. I might not know the answer, but I will try to find you the answer. So know that I'm a resource, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I saw a couple of things pop up and try to answer your questions. Yes, you'll get a copy of the slides. Thanks, Sean. Have we modeled or considered how the accelerated cost of living in Utah, particularly housing, might impact the state's growth trajectory over the next decade? So our projections really focus on births and deaths, and then thinking about, we have an economic factor. We try to consider these outside things, even things like, climate issues. Obviously, water has been a big topic of conversation throughout this year, throughout the West, and it's tricky to model those things. Obviously, we have some great analysts at Gardner Institute that are looking into those housing affordability questions. So Jim Wood is your guy. Dayon Essick is there to help and provide the more right now insights. But I think when you have these components of human choice, it's harder to model what might be happening moving forward. Michael Christensen, what has happened to the Native American population? We're going to keep digging into this. As I mentioned briefly, I do think in the national data, people were seeing more Native American, people marking Native American with something else. And so in those charts, we're doing each group alone, and then the two or more lumps everybody together that marked two or more. So that could be, especially with Native Americans, because of what we've seen in the past couple of years in different research, that's a group that does mark two or more. And so the group looks a lot smaller if you're looking at that group alone. So we are looking at it. We are hopefully a little later this fall going to have a paper that can provide some additional insights, because obviously that's a group that that's important to the state. That's a group that was here prior to the 1890 census. When we show up as Utah Territory, they weren't actually counted in that initial census of Utah Territory due to race and ethnicity, and the census has always had some political and social connections. So it took a while for that population to be fully enumerated through the census. So there's a lot going on there. We'll definitely keep investigating and keep you posted. Does the census follow religious affiliation at all? Are we seeing any shifts there? The census does not. I don't know if it was ever included. I know in other countries it is, but here it is not, especially in recent data, it's not included. There are some other non-governmental organizations that do look into that, that I could point you to, but I don't really dig into those data sources. Is there any way to know which groups people identified with when marking two or more? Yes, but it's a little more complicated to dig into the data. And so we are going to include an analysis of, we're trying to figure out the parameters so that we don't exclude people, but we don't get into all the way down to, if someone marked every box, but there's only one person, do we highlight that? We're trying to figure that out, trying to figure out that balance. But yeah, we're definitely going to include a little more detail in that paper that's going to come out in the fall. And I think, did COVID negatively impact data collection? In other words, did we collect less data? So one great thing about the 2020 census is that it was online for the first time. So you could go online and respond. You didn't have to interact with anybody. And the timing of that with everything that happened with COVID was like a gift. So Utah actually did really well for self-response rates, which is what the Census Bureau wants because it's the most accurate. We were, I think, number 10 in the top 10 states in the nation for self-response. There were some areas in rural Utah, or tribal areas, where they would have received a paper notice, like dropped at their doorstep because they didn't have, they use PO boxes or they have non-traditional street addresses. So outreach to those communities was delayed, but there was a very concerted effort to try to get all of those people. And the Census Bureau worked very hard to go out. As you saw, that 2020 hiring spike was a little lower. People were hesitant to go knock on strangers' doors during COVID. It was a pretty scary time. They extended the collection period for 3 months, which is part of why everything's been delayed. So the releases of the data have been delayed by a couple months due to these extended periods. Another thing was college students. They left right around the time that this is the census is referring to. So April 1 is Census Day, and if you ever need a fun fact. And so that was kind of spring break, and maybe students didn't come back from spring break, or they went to their parents, or they went somewhere else that they felt safe. So there was another very concerted effort that had to be ramped up really quickly because it was unexpected, to try to work with universities to find their on-campus students, information about on-campus students, off-campus students, tracking all those kids down. But the Census Bureau does feel very strongly that this data is good and representative. There's some operational quality metrics on their website you can go poke through if you are so inclined. One thing that did get impacted is the American Community Survey. So those characteristics, the 1-year data, which we only get for populations of 65,000 or more. So that's not a ton of communities in Utah, but the 1-year data is coming out as experimental because the data collection didn't quite match the standards that the census had hoped. They basically have 4 quarters of data and they lost a quarter due to COVID. And that one, there is a lot of human interaction if people don't fill out the form. So the 2021 year ACS is impacted, but the decennial Census Bureau feels good about it. It met their standards. The 5-year ACS, which provides insights to all Utah communities, they haven't officially said, but I've been in webinars where they feel confident that the 5-year is still going to be okay. So we have one data product that has been impacted by COVID, but we should be good otherwise. Let's see. Educational attainment levels over the decade. That's in the American Community Survey. I haven't looked into it in too much depth, so I'm gonna hold and we'll dive and jump together, turns into dump. We'll look into that a little more moving forward, the educational attainment question.
I'm not seeing any other questions, Mallory.
Okay, well.
Does anybody else have any other questions?
You get 1 more second.
1 more second. Mallory, thank you so much. This was really interesting. We are going to send out a link for the recording because it's a lot of information to take in. And we look forward to having you back again because this is such an important topic. And I want to thank everyone who's been on this webinar watching. I think it was really valuable for everyone. So I hope everyone has a good day. Mallory, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we'll see you all next time. Bye.